The United States Air Force has been wrestling for years with one of its most controversial decisions, whether to finally retire the fleet of A-10 Thunderbolt IIS. These rugged, slow-moving ground attack jets have served the American military for nearly half a century, and the debate over their future has never truly been resolved. But as of right now, they are not gone. In fact, they are very much in the fight, flying active combat operations over one of the most complex and layered air defense environments in the world, Iran. These low and slow attack jets are carrying a fascinating and telling array of air-to-ground and air-to-air weapons, including some of the oldest munitions in America's inventory and some of the newest. That combination alone tells a story about how military planners are thinking about this conflict and about the Warthog's role within it. The A-10 is beloved by ground troops in a way that very few other aircraft have ever been. Its reputation was built over decades of close air support missions, putting steel on target, close to friendly forces, in environments where precision and persistence mattered more than speed. But as beloved as it is, the same characteristics that make it exceptional at supporting infantry also make it dangerously exposed to the modern air defense threat that Iran still poses. And with the reported loss of at least 10 MQ-9 Reaper drones already shot down over Iran since this conflict began, the pilots flying Warthogs over the Middle East are walking a razor's edge every single sortie. So let's dig into what we actually know about A-10 combat operations in support of Operation Epic Fury, fill in the gaps with historical context and technical detail, and think seriously about what this might mean for the future of one of the most legendary aircraft ever built. Because there is a genuine possibility that what we are watching right now could be the Warthog's last major combat deployment in history. What this war is actually about. In the early morning hours of February 28, the United States and Israel launched a joint air campaign into Iran. The operation began with deep decapitation strikes targeting the nation's senior leadership, including the head of Iran's Islamist regime, Ayatollah Ali Khomeini. These were not incremental strikes or warning shots. They were designed to immediately collapse the command structure of the Iranian government. To understand how this was even possible, you need a bit of recent history. Iran's integrated air defense network had already taken serious damage in a 12-day war between Israel and Iran the previous year. That conflict culminated with American stealth bombers accompanied by F-22s flying air superiority and F-35s performing suppression of enemy air defenses, or SEAD missions striking Iran's deep subterranean nuclear facilities. Those strikes significantly degraded Iran's ability to protect its own skies. But degraded is not the same as destroyed, and that distinction matters enormously. Iran is a massive country. It covers approximately 636,371 square miles, roughly 4 times the size of Iraq, 3 times the size of France, and about 2.7 times the size of Ukraine. That is an enormous amount of territory in which to disperse, hide, and protect military assets. Iran has been preparing for conflict with the West for the better part of 50 years, and a central pillar of that preparation has always been the assumption that American air power would eventually overwhelm their conventional defenses. So Iran planned accordingly, not to win a straight fight, but to survive one, and to make that fight painful enough that American political will collapses before Iranian resistance does. And that shapes everything about how this conflict is unfolding on both sides. The United States absolutely has the military capacity to assemble a massive ground invasion force and push through Iran. That is not in serious question. But the cost in lives, in money, and in time would be enormous, and the American public does not have the appetite for another multi-year ground war in the Middle East. Iran's leadership understands this perfectly. Their goals in this conflict are not to defeat the United States militarily. Their goals are simply to survive, and to make the cost of this fight politically unacceptable to Americans and to the world. That means interrupting the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, launching drone and missile strikes against civilian targets in uninvolved nations to generate international pressure, and finding ways to score propaganda victories on the battlefield. If Iran manages to shoot down a single F-35, destroy a strategic bomber, or land a missile on an American warship, it does almost nothing to change the military balance of this conflict. But in terms of the information war, in terms of American public perception, and in terms of U.S. credibility on the world stage, those kinds of events carry enormous weight. Iran's strategy is to outlast American resolve, not to outfight American firepower. Iran's remaining air defense network is best described as layered but uneven. It has taken a serious beating from American aircraft primarily in the nation's southwest and from Israeli aircraft largely in the northwest. But assets are still operational and distributed throughout the country, coordinating with one another to whatever extent remains possible. These are not static, fixed installations. They are road-mobile systems that can be hidden in underground tunnels or hardened bunkers, concealed from reconnaissance aircraft and long-range targeting systems, and then rapidly repositioned to engage aircraft that enter their targeting envelope. At the top of the threat pyramid are Iran's 4 Russian-sourced S-300 PMU-2 long-range surface-to-air missile systems. These were delivered to Iran in 2016 after years of diplomatic delays, and they remain the most advanced air defense platforms in Iranian service. Each system is made up of a mobile command post, a fire control radar, acquisition radars, and up to 12 launchers, with each launcher capable of carrying 4 interceptors for a theoretical maximum of 48 missiles per battery. Armed with Russian 48 and 6 interceptors, these systems are credited with engagement envelopes that may exceed 200 kilometers, roughly 124 miles, and they can engage targets ranging from low-flying cruise missiles and tactical aircraft all the way up to some categories of ballistic missiles. Older but still relevant are Iran's Soviet-era S-200 long-range surface-to-air missile systems, which remain operational and are now armed with Iranian-built Fajr and Ghadar-class interceptors. These are domestically produced variants developed through a combination of reverse engineering and technology transfer from Russian systems. Their claimed ranges are significant, the Fajr reportedly reaching out to around 250 kilometers and the Ghadar to as far as 350 kilometers, though independent assessments of Iranian domestic weapons claims should always be approached with a degree of skepticism. Iran's flagship domestically produced long-range air defense system is the Bavar 373, a platform that Iran began developing during the years-long delay in receiving the S-300s they had paid for. Armed with Iran's most advanced Salyut 4 interceptors, the Bavar 373 claims an engagement range of around 300 kilometers. A further evolved variant of the interceptor, the Salyut 4B, reportedly incorporates a 2-stage rocket motor for extended range engagements and an active radar seeker, pushing the claimed engagement envelope out to 400 kilometers. That is an extraordinary claim, and its actual capability in the real world remains uncertain. But even at a fraction of that performance, this system represents a serious threat to non-stealthy aircraft operating anywhere near Iranian territory. Below the long-range systems, Iran operates a substantial array of medium and short-range air defense assets. These include older MIM-23 Hawk surface-to-air missile systems, ironically, systems that were originally provided to Iran by the United States before the 1979 revolution alongside Iran's domestic equivalents, the Mersad system. The domestically produced Khordad-15 adds a layer of medium-range coverage reportedly extending to around 150 kilometers. Short-range coverage is provided by systems like the Russian-sourced Tur M1, which has an engagement range of about 16 kilometers and is designed to kill precision-guided munitions and low-flying aircraft at close range. And then there are the Man-Portable Air Defense Systems, or MANPADS. Iran is known to operate at least half a dozen different types of shoulder-fired infrared-guided missiles, both domestically produced and Russian-sourced. These weapons have relatively limited reach, typically unable to engage aircraft flying above roughly 15,000 feet, but they are cheap,
easy to conceal,
nearly impossible to locate through aerial reconnaissance, and extremely dangerous to slow, low-flying aircraft operating in close air support roles. For a platform like the A-10, which often flies at just a few hundred feet above the ground at speeds well below those of other fighter jets, MANPADS represent one of the most persistent and difficult to counter threats on the battlefield. Put it all together and you have a network that ranges from shoulder-fired weapons at the tactical level all the way up to systems theoretically capable of engaging targets hundreds of miles away. It is not the integrated, sophisticated, nationally coordinated network Iran once had. That system was significantly disrupted in the previous conflict, but what remains is still dangerous, adaptive, and spread across a vast enough territory that eliminating it entirely is a massive ongoing undertaking. The MQ-9 Reaper losses, according to unnamed officials who spoke separately to Air and Space Forces magazine and to CBS News, At least 10 and possibly 11 MQ-9 Reaper remotely piloted aircraft have been shot down over Iran since the fighting began approximately 2 weeks ago, at a unit cost of anywhere between $20 and $35 million per drone depending on how the accounting is structured, and typically purchased in batches of 4 or more. That represents a total aircraft loss somewhere between $200 million and $350 million worth of hardware. To be clear, this was not entirely unexpected. The MQ-9 Reaper was designed and fielded specifically for use in uncontested airspace, the kind of low-threat environment that characterized the global war on terror, where American adversaries had no meaningful air defense capabilities to speak of. In those conditions, the Reaper's combination of powerful surveillance sensors, long loiter times, and significant weapons payload made it extraordinarily effective. But it was never built to survive against a real surface-to-air missile threat. The MQ-9 is not stealthy. It typically flies at altitudes of around 25,000 feet at speeds of only about 194 miles per hour. It carries no radar warning receiver or missile approach warning system in most configurations, and because the aircraft is flown remotely with crews on the ground potentially thousands of miles away, there is an inherent signal relay delay that prevents it from reacting quickly to inbound threats. In a serious air defense environment, these are fatal limitations. However, the Reaper is still being deployed over Iran for very good reasons. When equipped with the Gorgon Steer Increment 2 Wide Area Surveillance Pod, a single MQ-9 can actively monitor and track essentially all movement within roughly 100 square kilometers, about 62 square miles, for up to 27 hours at a stretch, with crews rotating every 8 hours to maintain fresh eyes on the controls. That kind of persistent wide area surveillance is invaluable in a conflict where the enemy is hiding mobile air defense systems across hundreds of thousands of square miles of territory. And because there is no pilot on board, the MQ-9 can be used for the highest risk reconnaissance and targeting missions without the moral and political cost of putting a human life directly in harm's way. There is also a certain calculus at work. When an Iranian surface-to-air missile crew pops out of cover to shoot down a Reaper, they reveal their position, and almost immediately after that missile launch, the ordnance tends to start falling from F-35s that were alerted to that position by the Reaper's loss. So while losing a Reaper is an expensive and tactically costly event, it is not without informational value in return. But that doesn't make those losses any less significant. As a reminder, if Iran can shoot down non-stealthy drones flying at 25,000 feet, they can certainly engage an A-10 flying at a few thousand feet at a third of the speed. The Reaper losses serve as a very concrete and very expensive demonstration that achieving true air supremacy over Iran is an ongoing and incomplete process, and that anyone operating a non-stealthy aircraft in or near Iranian airspace is doing so under real risk. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, built for the end of the world. The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II has been flying for the United States Air Force since 1977. It is, in nearly every measurable sense, a product of a completely different era of warfare designed to serve a mission set that, thankfully, never came to pass. In a threat environment that no longer exists in the form it was built to counter, the aircraft was built almost entirely around a single weapon, the Galit/A Avenger rotary cannon. This is not a small gun. It is a 7-barrel, hydraulically driven Gatling-style weapon that fires 30mm shells at a rate of approximately 3,900 rounds per minute in its high-rate setting that works out to about 65 rounds per second. The rounds themselves come in a mix of types, including armor-piercing incendiary rounds with depleted uranium penetrators for defeating armored vehicles, and high-explosive incendiary rounds for softer targets. The weapon is so powerful and so heavy that Fairchild Republic essentially designed the rest of the aircraft around it. The nose landing gear is offset to the right so that the gun barrel is aligned with the aircraft's center line, ensuring the recoil force is directed straight back through the fuselage rather than inducing a yaw. The A-10's primary Cold War mission was to serve as the point of the spear in the U.S. Army's air-land battle doctrine in Europe. The scenario was this: Soviet armored tens of thousands of tanks and armored fighting vehicles would pour through the Fulda Gap and other choke points in West Germany. The A-10, working in close coordination with A-64 Apache attack helicopters, would tear into those armored columns from the front while long-range missiles and other aircraft struck Soviet rear areas and logistics. The goal was not necessarily to stop the invasion that was considered an almost impossible task given the projected scale of the Soviet assault, but rather to slow it, to attrit it, and to buy enough time for NATO forces and the broader alliance to mass an appropriate defense and counterattack. That mission set was always understood to be extraordinarily dangerous. A-10 pilots flying into dense Soviet air defenses at low altitude and low speed were not expected to survive in large numbers. The aircraft was therefore designed from the ground up to absorb punishment and keep flying. It features a titanium armored bathtub surrounding the cockpit that weighs approximately 1,200 pounds and is rated to withstand direct hits from 23mm anti-aircraft cannon rounds, the primary armament of Soviet mobile air defense systems like the ZSU-23-4 Shilka. The flight control systems are doubled, with full hydraulic redundancy, and a third mechanical backup in case both hydraulic systems are destroyed. A-10 pilots have returned to base flying on that third mechanical backup system. The engine's two General Electric TF-34 high-bypass turbofans mounted high on the rear fuselage are placed in a position where damage to one does not necessarily affect the other, and the aircraft was specifically designed to remain flyable after losing an engine, half of a tail surface, or in some documented cases, significant portions of a wing. All of this survivability came at a cost. Those twin TF-34 engines, each producing around 9,000 pounds of thrust, can push the Warthog to a maximum speed of only 518 miles per hour. In actual combat operations, the aircraft typically cruises at around 340 miles per hour, slower than many propeller-driven aircraft of World War II at altitude. It was not built for speed. It was built to take hits and keep fighting. As one engineer involved in the original design famously put it, the A-10 was built for the First Battle of World War III, a conflict that everyone understood would probably be the last major war in human history. When the Cold War ended and that apocalyptic mission set evaporated, the A-10 might easily have been retired. But something unexpected happened. In the 1991 Persian Gulf War, and then throughout 2 decades of the global war on terror, A-10 pilots reinvented their aircraft as the ultimate close air support platform. In uncontested airspace, the Warthog's greatest weaknesses became irrelevant and its greatest strengths became legendary. The 30mm cannon became famous for its unmistakable sound, a deep, tearing BRRRT that became something of a cultural touchstone among ground troops who knew what it meant. The aircraft could loiter over a battle area for upwards of 2 hours before needing to refuel, roughly 4 times longer than an F-16 can sustain in most combat configurations. Ground troops loved it with an intensity that is genuinely unusual in the relationship between infantry and aviation. Why A-10s in this fight? And what are they actually doing? Traditional military thinking would suggest the Warthog has no business operating in this kind of threat environment until air supremacy has been definitively established. A-10s are vulnerable to essentially every category of weapon Iran still has available, from manpads to short-range missile systems to medium and long-range batteries to any fighter aircraft that manages to get airborne. They are, broadly speaking, the most vulnerable aircraft in the American inventory to the widest range of threats Iran can bring to bear. And yet, U.S. Central Command confirmed the use of A-10s in the earliest stages of Operation Epic Fury, reportedly flying combat sorties out of Jordan alongside F-16s, F/A-18s, F-22s, and F-35s within the first 24 hours of the conflict. In that list of combat aircraft, the Warthog stands out not for its capabilities but for its vulnerability. Every other aircraft on that list has meaningful stealth characteristics, much higher speed margins, and in the case of the F-22, exceptional beyond visual range air-to-air capability. The A-10 has none of those things. So what are they doing there? CENTCOM has not provided a detailed accounting of A-10 missions, but the photographic evidence they have released 3 images of an A-10 flying combat operations against Iran gives us a detailed look at the weapons loadout the aircraft is carrying, and from that loadout, we can make some informed inferences about the mission. The most likely answer is that A-10s are being used in areas where local air superiority has already been established by other assets. F-22s have cleaned up any Iranian fighter threat, and F-35s have suppressed or destroyed any air defense systems in the immediate operational area, but where a persistent, heavily armed, low and slow loiter capability is exactly what commanders need. The primary threat in those areas is not fighter aircraft or surface-to-air missiles. It is drones. Iran and its proxies operate a large inventory of Shahd-style one-way attack drones, cheap, relatively slow, and proliferating in large numbers. Against that kind of target, the A-10 is actually extremely well suited. Its lower cruise speed makes drone engagements easier than they would be for much faster aircraft like F-15S or F-16S, and it can loiter in a given area far longer than almost any other tactical aircraft. Additionally, A-10s could be employed in a similar role to what they were doing in the global war on terror, hunting down drone launchers, ballistic missile launch vehicles, and other mobile ground targets within areas where the air defense threat has been sufficiently reduced. The weapons loadout. CENTCOM released 3 photographs of an A-10 flying combat operations in this conflict, and the weapons visible in those images are revealing. The combination of old and new munitions tells a story about both the A-10's adaptability and the nature of the threat environment it is operating in. The largest weapons visible are AGM-65 Maverick air-to-ground missiles. The Maverick is actually older than the A-10 itself, first entering service in 1972, making it one of the longest-serving precision-guided munitions in the American arsenal. The variants still in operational use today are significantly updated from the original, and they come in several configurations depending on the seeker type. Imaging infrared seekers allow the pilot to acquire and lock onto a target based on its thermal signature, making them highly effective against vehicles with warm engines. Laser-guided variants can be designated by the firing aircraft or by a separate designator on the ground or in the air. Either variant can deliver warheads of up to 300 pounds to targets as far as 14 miles away. It is not possible to determine from the released imagery exactly which seeker type is installed on this aircraft's Mavericks, but either would be effective against the target sets the A-10 is likely pursuing. Supporting the Maverick and providing the pilot with targeting capability is the AAS-28 Lightning targeting pod, visible outboard of the Maverick on the pilot's right side. This pod provides forward-looking infrared imaging, a laser spot tracker, and a laser designator, giving the Warthog pilot the ability to find, identify, track, and designate targets at standoff ranges. For a platform that was originally designed around a gun that requires getting within 4,000 feet of the target, having a precision targeting capability that works at miles of distance is transformative. On the opposite side of the aircraft, outboard of the second Maverick, is an LAU-131 rocket pod. Based on historical precedent and the operational context, the almost certain payload of that pod is 7 AGR-20 Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System 2 rockets, also known as APCUS-2. This is one of the most interesting weapons in the current American arsenal, and one that is particularly well suited to this fight. The APCUS-2 takes existing, unguided 70mm Hydra rockets from America's vast existing stockpile and adds a relatively simple laser guidance section that deploys 4 fins after launch. The result is a laser-guided precision weapon with a 10-pound blast fragmentation warhead that can engage targets from more than 7 miles away in the air-to-air mode, and out to about 12 miles against ground targets. The cost is extraordinarily low compared to most precision-guided munitions. The guidance unit runs between $15,000 and $20,000 per round, and it snaps onto rockets that were already sitting in storage. Against slow-moving SHOD-style drones, which themselves cost somewhere around $50,000, the economics are highly favorable. You are killing a $50,000 drone with a $20,000 rocket, and often a single hit is sufficient. Also visible in the released imagery are 2 AIM-9M Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. These are among the older weapons in the American inventory, first entering service in their current M variant in the early 1980s, and they are now being phased out of frontline service in favor of the much more capable AIM-9X. The 9X has not been integrated onto the A-10. The 9M is an infrared-guided, short-range air-to-air missile with a heat-seeking seeker and a relatively modest kinematic envelope compared to modern missiles. A-10 pilots do train for air-to-air combat as a contingency. We published a video on this subject some time ago, and in a scenario where Iranian fighters somehow made it through the air superiority umbrella being maintained by F-22S and F-35S, the Sidewinders give the Warthog at least a fighting chance. But in the current operational context, there is a second, equally plausible use for these weapons, as a fire-and-forget drone engagement option at longer ranges than the Cannon or the APCUS. An AIM-9M is not cheap to replace with a new AIM-9X, which costs more than $400,000 per missile. But publicly available cost assessments suggest that the realized cost of expending a 9M that was already approaching the end of its service life is actually around $84,000, making it a potentially cost-effective option against certain drone targets, and a way of using up aging inventory that would need to be disposed of anyway. And then there is the cannon itself, the GAU-8/A Avenger. We know for certain that at least one A-10 has used its cannon in this conflict, because footage uploaded from Iraq on March 12 clearly captured the unmistakable sound of an A-10 unloading at what were reported to be Iran-backed militia fighters on the ground. The cannon fires so quickly and with such force that it can make very short work of a drone, a vehicle, or an unprotected infantry position. The cost per round is difficult to pin down precisely from publicly available data, with online estimates ranging from about $25 per round for practice ammunition to as high as $136 per combat round. No A-10 pilot fires a single round. Even a half-second burst at the weapon's high rate of fire dumps about 32 rounds downrange. So the cost of a single cannon burst runs somewhere between roughly $800 and $4,300. Even at the high end, that is almost certainly cheaper than any drone it is being used against. Can the Warthog survive its own budget? None of this changes the underlying reality of the A-10's position within the Air Force structure. The question of whether the Warthog should be retired has never really been about whether it can still fight. It can fight. It is fighting right now. The question has always been whether the money spent keeping it operational could be better invested elsewhere. Sustaining the A-10 fleet, just keeping the aircraft in serviceable flying condition, not conducting major upgrades, now costs the United States Air Force an estimated $1.3 billion per year, and that figure is rising as the aircraft ages. Every year, maintaining an airframe that first flew in the mid-1970s becomes more expensive because components wear out, supply chains thin out, and the engineering expertise required to keep these specific systems running becomes harder to find and more costly to sustain. The Air Force's argument for divestment is straightforward. The missions that A-10s perform today could be accomplished by more survivable aircraft that also have a wider range of capabilities. The F-16, for example, has the same 11 external hardpoints as the A-10 and can carry essentially the same weapons, including the Maverick, the Upcus-2, and the Sidewinder. An F-16 can loiter for shorter periods, but it is significantly faster, harder to shoot down, and capable of performing air superiority, SEAD, and long-range strike missions that the A-10 simply cannot. That $1.3 billion spent on A-10 sustainment in 2026 could instead purchase 13 additional F-35 as above the currently planned by taking the annual acquisition from 25 aircraft to 38. That is a real and significant trade-off, and it is not a frivolous argument. Supporters of the A-10 counter that no aircraft matches the Warthog's combination of loiter time, low operating cost per flight hour relative to more complex aircraft, and ability to operate from austere forward airstrips with minimal ground support infrastructure. The A-10 can land on a road if it has to. It can be refueled and rearmed by a small crew with limited equipment. In a large-scale, contested environment where established air bases might be targeted by ballistic missiles, that kind of flexibility has real value. The other counter-argument is more emotional but no less real. Ground troops trust the A-10 in a way that they simply do not trust other aircraft. That trust is built on decades of experience, on the recognizable sound of the cannon, on the aircraft's willingness to get low and close to the fight in ways that faster, more expensive jets sometimes will not. Whether that institutional trust translates into meaningful tactical effectiveness is a harder question to answer, but it is not nothing. The twilight of an icon. The A-10 Thunderbolt II is in the twilight of its service life, and everyone who works with it knows it. The airframes are approaching 50 years old. The wings have been replaced on many of them, and some aircraft are on their second set of replacement wings. The titanium bathtub, the redundant flight controls, the offset landing gear, these engineering solutions that seemed so innovative in the 1970s now exist in aircraft that are held together by decades of maintenance work and an enormous amount of institutional dedication from the crews who love them. What Operation Epic Fury appears to be demonstrating is that there is still a narrow but real operational niche for the A-10, specifically in environments where local air superiority has been established and the primary threat is slow, cheap, proliferating drones and proxy ground forces. In that environment, the A-10's long loiter time, large weapons payload, low operating cost, and extreme cannon capability make it more cost-effective than almost any alternative, but that niche is narrow. It disappears the moment a serious air defense threat reappears, and the cost of maintaining the capability to fill that niche is $1.3 billion a year and climbing. So yes, the A-10 is still finding ways to get into the fight, even a quarter of the way through the 21st century. It is carrying both the oldest and the newest weapons in the American inventory into one of the most complex complex operational environments on the planet, and it is apparently doing so effectively enough that commanders are choosing to use it. But that should not be mistaken for a reprieve. The A-10 is old, it is increasingly expensive, and the operational windows in which it can safely be employed are growing narrower with each new generation of air defense technology that proliferates around the world. What we may be watching right now, in the skies over Iran and the battlefields of Iraq, is the last major combat deployment of the most beloved attack aircraft in American history, and in true Warthog fashion, taking hits, absorbing punishment, and still flying when by rights it probably should have landed years ago. It is going out with guns blazing.